Coming up on tonight's episode of Faith versus Culture, we're going to talk about deconstructing your faith. Does it have to lead to deconversion? We'll have that conversation with Sean McDowell coming up next.
To have sex before you marry is a bad idea.
Don't tell me there's no such thing as gun violence.
That just depends on your definition of when life begins.
There are problems of sin and habit that cannot be solved outside the person of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Faith versus Culture right here on the CBN News Channel. My name is Dan Andros. I'm joined by my co-host Billy Hallowell and with author and professor at Biola, Sean McDowell. How's it going, guys?
Doing well.
Good. All right. Well, we have a great conversation ahead of us today. And there's been a lot of talk. We've seen it over the last few years about deconstruction, especially when it comes to celebrities. I think a few musicians in particular are kind of, and actually, of course, Rhett and Link, popular YouTubers, they famously deconverted. But you hear a lot of, besides just deconversion, what precedes that is this talk of deconstructing. I really went in and I kind of took apart, I went under the hood and I took everything apart and I'm looking at my faith and I'm seeing what do I really believe here? And then that's what they say precedes this deconversion of the faith. But Sean, wanted to get you on here to have this conversation because you have a personal sort of, I guess, relationship with this question.
I do, yeah, in my own story, but also a number of conversations I've had with people who have both deconverted and deconstructed, but then reconstructed their faith. I guess my story is unique in some way, having grown up in a Christian home with a very recognizable father as a speaker, as a writer, with a public ministry as an apologist. In case somebody hasn't connected the two, Josh McDowell is my father. And when I was, I think, 19 years old, just went through a period of questioning and doubt, not really sure if I believed this faith that had been passed on to me. And knew I needed to have conversations with my dad. So we were up in Breckenridge, Colorado. And I remember we went out for coffee and I just said something effective, Dad, I'm not sure what I believe. I don't know if I think Christianity is fully true, not knowing how he would respond. And my dad did a few things well that are often absent in cases when people fully deconvert. One of the things he did well is he didn't freak out. He didn't get reactive. He didn't get angry. In fact, he looked at me and goes, son, I think that's great. And I was like, Dad, did you hear what I said? Are you like writing a talk in your head? He goes, look, I raised you to seek after truth above all else. You can't live on my convictions. You've got to find out what you think is true. And you know your mom and I love you no matter what. So he gave me space to ask questions, assured me of our relationship, and said, I'm here for you to help you along the way. That's what I needed. And I did find answers that are satisfactory to me. For so many people who deconvert, what happens is they're told you can never ask questions, you can never doubt, just have faith. In fact, one former Christian that I spoke to, he said that he's now a big time YouTuber and an atheist. He was given the advice, physically sleep on his Bible, and like osmosis, it would seep into him and help him stay in the faith. And you're laughing because you should, but that's the sad kind of advice and way we often process these stories.
There's a lot of shame, I think, that people feel when they have doubt, but the reality is everybody goes through doubt at one point or another. And it's interesting. I'm not shocked by your dad's reaction at all, knowing who he is and knowing him and having interacted with him. But a lot of people in his position could have said, this is embarrassing. You can't tell people this, because this is somebody who everybody knows who he is, right? He's, one of the most recognizable names, as you said, but yet he gave you that space. How long was the period that it took for you to sort of go through that journey from there?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I don't remember a night, like when my dad tells a story, he's on this big journey to disprove Christianity. If I remember, it was like 6 p.m. or 11 p.m. in a library in London. He's like, bam, it's true. I don't have that moment. I mean, in fact, some ways in Christian circles, we I almost thought like God can only use you if you have this dramatic testimony where you're in prison, you're part of a gang, you almost die or something. And I remember thinking, someday I'm going to have this awesome experience, then God can use me. And a part of that is this moment of realization. I was wrong, this Paul experience on the road to Damascus. So I don't really remember. It was a process for me. And I think it was really just realizing, okay, I don't have certainty about this. I can live with doubts, was a part of just deconstructing, I think, a simplistic faith that I had and really opening up the door to a lasting, real faith. And I think along that journey was also a real genuine experience of grace for me. And it wasn't just like this outpouring one-time experience, but it was growing up and, I always knew it was true. I'm not sure I fully ever stopped believing that Christianity was true. But I think when I began to realize, reading Henry Nouwen's book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, that there's two ways of being lost. You can be lost like the young son in just wild living. You can be lost like the older son who's being dutiful and loyal. And I was that kid. I didn't do the big sins, but realized I profoundly prided myself in not doing those sins and was just as absent of God's grace. Coming to that realization over time was really what made me go, whoa, this Christian faith makes sense.
I just want to pause and stop on the line that your dad had. I think it's a fantastic line, and it's one that I've probably used some version of it, not as witty or concise as his, but son, you can't live on my convictions. What a great response that is. And someone as a parent of teens, I have a 16-year-old daughter, and I've got my son's almost a teenager now. So these conversations, I'm expecting them, at some point. And I think it's an admonition to parents to go ahead and have the tough conversations now. Like, don't be afraid of them. Even if you don't know the answer to something, look for it together. We can have confidence in what Scripture says, that it's true, and that we can be okay with it, answering those questions and looking into them. We don't have to fear the result. So I love that line from your dad.
And you know what, where that line came from is my father had planned ahead in his mind and practiced how he would respond if one of my sisters said, Dad, I'm pregnant. Or if I said, Dad, I'm gay. Or my sister says, Dad, I don't believe in God anymore. Or I said, Dad, I'm not going to college. I'm going to get rich off this scam. Like whatever scenario you want to think of, he was trying to think through, how would I respond so he didn't react in that moment in a way of his own insecurity or issues, but was able to focus on me. And that's got me to think that through with my own kids. So anybody watching this, if you're in relationships, how we respond doesn't end things. We can always go back and mend it. But when someone comes to me and says something like that, I want to assure them of my relationship, my love. I want to listen, create a safe space. Then we can get to the issues down the road. And that's where I think he responded exactly the right way.
All right, this is good stuff. We have more. There were three things you pointed to in your recent article here, Sean, and I think we just got through the first one here. So we want to tackle the rest, and we'll do that on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. Back in a second. All right, we're back on Faith versus Culture. Dan Andros here, Billy Hallowell, and Sean McDowell there. We are talking about defeating doubt and what do you do when that, creeping doubt sort of kind of lurks in the background there and you're not sure what to do with it as a Christian. And we all have different circumstances. Sean was just describing his growing up in a Christian home and, maybe being a little hesitant because he wasn't sure how, his apologist dad and his author dad was gonna take that, when his son is coming to him saying, I'm not sure if I believe this, when that's kind of like his vocation. So great response there in the first segment. But let's go to the second point in your article here, Sean, that you talk about when we're talking about deconstructing the faith, but not deconverting. And you kind of talk about your experience within the church. So let's break that down a little bit about why that matters.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is I've had dozens of conversations with people who've left the Christian faith, atheists, agnostics, skeptics. some public and some private. And not in every case, but in many cases, if not most, there's a heartbreaking bad experience in the church. They've seen hypocrisy, they've seen abuse. And I want to be careful to not make somebody who's watching this who's not a believer feel like I'm dismissing them leaving the faith, saying, well, you just had a bad experience, of course. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a lot of reasons why people can and do disengage their faith and can and do disengage the church. And if Christians are hypocrites and they're shallow and they have a bad experience, it's natural to start to think, you know what? Is this message real? When Christians are living no differently than those in the wider culture. That's why Os Guinness, in his book Fool's Talk, he said the biggest question and issue for Christians to respond to is the challenge of hypocrisy. And so in conversation, I want to bring that to the surface. And recently I was having a live conversation with an atheist, and I just was trying to prompt him to think about this, because this is a thoughtful guy. I said, you left the Christian faith. What I want to know is how in your mind do you intentionally separate the bad fundamentalist experience you had from the claims of truth, the truth of Christianity that can be lived out differently? How do you separate those? And partly I was curious. The other part was I was trying to suggest to him maybe he hadn't really done that and is reacting against a bad experience. And so it raised the question, what's the horse driving the cart here? Sometimes it's experience, sometimes you think something is false. I want to get to the heart of that and address what the real issue is for that individual I'm talking
with. What, when you look at all of the reasons, right, that people will give, what is the one for you that is often the most understandable?
Oh, gosh. That's an interesting question. I think it's probably hurt and pain that people have experienced. I've seen cancel culture done by Christians in my family. And I told a pastor this morning, I said the un-Christ-like, unbiblical way that many Christians respond. I get it why people deconvert. Doesn't justify it, but I get it on a visceral level. So I think that one.
On the emotional level of seeing how things affect people and how they feel and the anger and the frustration, you could understand how somebody would get to that place where they would say, I'm done and none of this is real. Even though, again, we're not excusing that, the understanding those emotions.
Yeah, I get it. We Christians do not always live out what we say we believe, and we've got to clean up our own house first. So emotionally, I understand that issue, not intellectually. I'm not going to leave the faith, no matter how much hurt and pain is there, because I think it's true, and I think Jesus rose from the grave. But that's why I believe, and that's how my dad taught me to think about my faith. There's an awful lot of people who are told, come to Jesus and he'll make your life better. Maybe not in those words, but that's a theology they've adopted. And then all of a sudden their life doesn't seem better. So of course they're going to chuck the faith if that's a theology and experience that they have.
Yeah, and I can open a little theological can of worms here, but when you're talking about deconverting, of course, there is one school of thought, theologically speaking, that you can't lose your salvation once you get it. And so somebody who may think they've deconverted, maybe they were never really actually fully believing in the first place. So when you're talking about these experiences, and why I bring it up is that maybe you don't really have yet a true believer. And so they're still evaluating all these things that are going on and what they're seeing in these experiences in the church and bad experiences in the church and being canceled. And then, that's just the moment that just pushes them away, completely.
So you're right. There's going to be difference over whether some people can lose the faith or no one can lose the faith. But recently I was having a conversation with a former youth pastor who left his faith. And I said, I'm interested. When did you know you were a sinner and cried out for God's grace and became a Christian? Take me back to that moment. He looked at me like a deer in the headlights. He goes, I didn't come to Christ because I was a sinner needing redemption. I came to Christ because I was hurting and told that Jesus would make my life better.
Wow.
That is a false gospel. And he was given a platform at a huge church to teach a lot of people this false gospel. So if his life doesn't turn out better, then of course he's going to walk away because he came on false pretenses.
I mean, you see people in other countries going through the most unimaginable and horrific circumstances, right? And they're some of the most joy-filled, gospel-driven people. And I think what you just said, it just made that come to mind for me, because when I think about those people, they're able to have that peace and that joy because of their faith, and not on the promise that it's going to get better. Because guess what? For some of them, their lives may end, right? It may not get better. Their lives here on earth may end. But that's such an important distinction to draw out, what you just talked about.
Well, I think so too. I think at the heart of it, a lot of people disengage the faith because of bad theology, because we've been trained to think you won't suffer if you follow Jesus. I'm like, just read the Bible, pick up your cross and follow me. James says expect to suffer. Hebrews says expect to suffer. First Peter says it. Jesus taught it. Paul wrote letters talking about this. It's a major theme in the scriptures, and there's a joy that we can have through that. But if we're not taught that deep theology and things don't go well, then it's natural for somebody to chuck their faith at that point, sadly.
Yeah, it really is. And we have time for one more break here with Sean McDowell. And so I want to get to the last point in his article here on how we should tackle doubt and how we should approach it. So we'll do that on the other side of the break. This is Faith versus Culture. Back in a second. All right, welcome back to Faith versus Culture. We're talking about defeating doubt and how do we approach doubt as Christians with Dr. Sean McDowell, and Billy Hallowell is with me as well. And also want to mention, you can check out Sean McDowell's YouTube page. Sean, what is the address for YouTube? Just search your name and your YouTube page will pop up.
Yep, that'll work.
Yeah, great. A lot of great videos coming out from Sean there, and very much worth a watch. Encourage you to go over there and check it out and subscribe and follow and all of that good stuff. So in the remaining few minutes we have here with you, Sean, let's talk about the last point here you address in your article about searching and finding these answers to tough questions.
Yeah, so when somebody disengages their faith in almost every circumstance, I mean deconvert, you almost always hear them say, it's because the Bible has contradictions. I don't think God exists, problem of evil, science and faith, exclusivity, Christianity, etc. It's almost always couched intellectually. Rarely does somebody say, you know what, I just want to sleep with my girlfriend, moral or volitional or emotional. But the reality is we're complex beings and we have a lot of reasons that coalesce emotionally, relationally, volitionally, and intellectually. They're all at play. For me, intellectually was a key piece of this. There were other components too. And it's funny, even though my dad was and still is a famous apologist, I kind of needed to find answers from somebody else. I think of like people on their journey, like, you know, Luke needed a mentor, and, you know, the Lord of the Rings, they needed Gandalf, and the Karate Kid needed Mr. Miyagi. Like, you always need a mentor outside of your biological parents. And to me, that was people like J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig, Greg Koukl, some classical thinkers, of course, in the history of the Christian faith that I began to really study for myself. And I read skeptics during this time. I've read the Quran, Book of Mormon since, really trying to say, does Christianity make sense? And I'm convinced that it does. And I've had a number of skeptics say to me, like, well, that's because you write books and you have all this at play. And I was like, I had zero intention of becoming an apologist or writer or speaker. If you told me that in college, I would have said you're crazy. When my wife, when we got married, she goes, just so you know, I'm not like your mom. And I was like, don't worry, I have no intentions of being an apologist and having any public ministry. That had nothing to do with it for me. I found answers that I think about Christianity making the most sense. So for people watching this, I'm telling you, if you're willing to seek the answers, good answers are out there, and thoughtful Christians have been wrestling with these ideas for a long time.
Before we go here quickly, obviously we've seen statistics for the last, 8 years now telling us that at least nominally Americans are moving away from the label of Christian. And we're seeing these stories again and again of people who are, deconverting from their faith. They're leaving their faith, very public figures, as we were discussing. What do you think what's your prediction on what is going to happen with this in terms of those trends?
I think we're going to keep hearing these kind of stories on the macro level. There's larger and larger people identifying as the nones, Nones. Our culture has been culturally Christian for a while. And I think even while we did that, and even today, most people who identify as Christian would not really follow and adopt the worldview that Jesus taught. So I think we're going to continue to see this. What my concern is, we have worship leaders, we have former large pastors, we have authors and speakers who have deconstructed. And sometimes people are given a platform too quickly that puts pressure on them. We're seeing the fallout from this. Well, now everybody can have an instant platform with just a TikTok video or a YouTube video or an Instagram feed. So I think we're actually setting ourselves up more now if we don't intentionally mentor and teach this next generation how to think and live Christianly, for seeing a greater amount of this down the road than we have seen. And I'm not naturally a pessimist, but I do think the signs are pointing in that direction, and we have to operate on that possibility rather than pretend, well, we've seen a few deconstruction stories, this is done. Sorry, it's not.
All right, Sean, thanks so much for being here. Appreciate you.
You too.
All right. We'll be back in a second. This is Faith versus Culture. All right, that's all the time we have for this episode of Faith versus Culture. And Billy, it's always great having Sean on. There's just a lot of wisdom from Sean.
Yeah, and I think right now, a lot of people, they need to hear those stories because they've got people in their lives who are going through the same thing he went through when he was 19, right? So it's a good reminder for how to react in the right way.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this week. We will see you back here next week. God bless. We'll see you next time.